Greeting, YouTube. I was born in the US, which means I was born into a country that uses the most absurd system of measurements known to humanity. The only way it could get worse is that if each person were allowed to come up with their own scale. I mean, an inch, that's a hand, that's a span, 9 inches, cubic, 18 inches, yard, 36 inches. Yeah, that's where these came from. Foot from an actual foot. That's where these measurements came from. That's just a smidge inconsistent now, isn't it? Now, I use it myself all the time because it's handy. Literally, my hand span is approximately 9 inches. So I need to go quickly, boonk, boonk, that's 18 inches, roughly. I also have a multi-tool on me all the time when I'm outside that will let me measure things, but this is faster. Boom, 9 inches. But it isn't accurate. There's a variation. Do I have my fingers spread the same distance every time? You know what I mean? As I get older, that's probably not going to be the same because my hands don't function as well as they did 20 or 30 years ago. But I think in this damn system. I think in gallons and pints and miles. I think in Fahrenheit, not Celsius or centigrade. I think in this system all the time. Volumes, weights, I think in pounds and ounces. When I pick something up, I can say, no, this is about, 4.5 ounces probably, maybe 4. And if I weigh it, I'm probably pretty close. But it's frustrating because it doesn't make any sense. Whereas metric does. It does make sense. There are mathematical formulas you can use to figure out things in metric. But even if you didn't have a mathematical formula to figure out the exact definition of a centimeter or the exact definition of a degree in Celsius or a volume, if you didn't have that, the fact that it's just based on 10 makes it better. Even if every single base unit in metric were utterly arbitrary, just like that thumb thing. If that were true, and it isn't, it would still be better because it's based on 10. I know what a centimeter is. Why? Because it's 10 millimeters. It's a tenth of a meter. Bingo. Done. Or a hundredth meter, sorry. You know what I mean? I know it. Decameter, which is a tenth, not a common measurement. You don't hear a lot of people talking about decameters, but it is technically a measurement. It's 10 centimeters. But I don't think in it. When I think centimeters, I have to stop for a second. I go, oh, that's like 2.54 inches, which I believe is what the conversion is. And I can do that pretty fast in my head. But I have to do it in my head. And I don't want to. It's annoying. I've gotten much better at it over time, partly because, for example, when I'm doing weights for videos and stuff, I always start with the metric. And sometimes I only use the metric weights because I know that there's a big audience out there that uses the metric system as opposed to the US. Now, because I'm speaking English, I am going to get a lot of English speakers, but there are a lot of English speakers in the world that use metric as well. So it isn't just, a non-English speaking thing. And again, it just makes more sense. It does. I always found it fascinating that the temperature of negative 40 degrees is the same both in Fahrenheit and centigrade. I mean, it makes sense that there would be some, cross reference point. I mean, the system, it would be kind of weird if there wasn't any, but it's kind of cool in my mind that it was negative 40, which is a temperature I think I've only experienced like once, and I didn't enjoy it. And I'll probably never experience it again thanks to climate change. Um, but I don't want to think in the imperial system. I want to think in metric, but I can't, and I never will. And we keep foisting that archaic, absolute, chaotic mess on generation after generation of kids, where we could have been raising them in metric so they would have a system that makes sense and a system that lets them transparently, discuss lengths and measures and volumes and weights with other people in other places. Other units that you might find in Imperial are a chain. That a chain, I believe, is it 27? I think a rod is 9. I think a chain is 27 feet. I think it's a rod is 9 feet, and then a fathom is 6 feet. A rod is like 9 feet, I think, and a chain is 27. Because I use Imperial in high fantasy games because it just seems more appropriate because of the kind of work. It's a faux medieval kind of thing. But when I do science fiction, I want to see metric. So when I read a science fiction role-playing game and I'm seeing feet, it's always very jarring. It just doesn't seem to fit to my mind. I'm almost like, why did you do that? That's a weird thing to do. I also think it makes perfect sense for miniatures or for a grid, or better yet, a hexagon in a science fiction game to have meters. Each unit, each grid, whether it's squares or hexagons, to be a meter wide. That's an interesting thought. You call it a grid whether it's square or hexagon. Is grid a generic term just meaning a repetition of the same shaped object? Oh, never thought about that before. Tell me if I'm wrong or right on that one. Is that appropriate to call it a grid? I don't know. But I always loved working with graph paper that had hexagons when I was younger. Though when I came to drawing, I did use squares. I used, and which was 10 squares per inch. At least it was tens, because that gave me the degree of control I needed when it came to sketching. But yeah, I wish I thought in metric. It breaks my heart that I don't. And it's really frustrating to me knowing that my nephews, who are still kids, are going to be thinking in that, and that it's very likely that their kids are going to think in imperial as well. They're not going to think in metric. And even if they go into a field where metric makes far more sense, like if you're talking about engineering or medicine, where those kind of measurements are very important, they're still not going to have the reflexive response to those measurements the way that a person raised in the damn system would. So yeah, I would love for the whole imperial system to become an absolute archaic piece of our past that we only ever talk about when we're discussing high fantasy role-playing games. That would be awesome, but it isn't the case. It's one that the U.S. is stuck with, and one other country whose name I can't remember also uses it, which is also strange. But yeah, let's get rid of it. Let's go to metric. Yes, it will make the people who are currently alive and aware of measurements their lives difficult for a bit, but I'm okay with that. If you make my life miserable for a few years until I can slowly push myself to the point where it makes a lot more sense than it does now. But we're not doing that, and it kind of breaks my heart.